"Sir, please check that desk." The trembling voice of Sophie, the 6-year-old daughter of the housekeeper, made Alessandro Moretti, the most powerful mafia boss in New York, freeze in place just before stepping into his secret meeting with his closest allies at the Long Island estate. At first, Alessandro only smiled faintly, dismissing it as the baseless worry of a child who had wandered up to the second floor. But a strange instinct, together with the panic in her blue eyes and the small fingers clenched tightly around the hem of her red shirt, made him change his mind. Seconds later, as he knelt beneath the massive walnut desk and the beam of his flashlight swept into the farthest corner, the face of a man who had not known fear in 20 years of rule suddenly turned pale. The steady, blinking red LED beneath that desk that night marked the beginning of a chilling secret that no one, not even Alessandro himself, could ever have imagined. Alessandro rose from beneath the desk in silence. He did not stand quickly. He did not brush the dust from his knees. He rose the way a man rises from a grave he was not meant to leave, slowly, deliberately, with a body that had already begun rearranging itself around a new fact. He stepped into the hallway, pulled the door closed behind him with the softness of a man who did not want to wake the house, and only then allowed his hand to lift the phone from the inside pocket of his jacket. Sophie was already gone. Maria had come running the moment a guard whispered to her that her daughter was on the second floor, and she had gathered the child into her arms with the frantic apology of a mother who believed she was about to lose her position. Alessandro had stopped her at the top of the marble staircase, placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, and told her, quietly, to take Sophie down to the west parlor. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but him. Maria had not understood. She had only obeyed. He dialed a number that was not stored in his contacts, one he had memorized 20 years ago and never used. Study. Now. No sirens. No radio outside the internal channel. He ended the call before the voice on the other end could answer. 7 minutes. 4 men arrived through the service entrance, moving through the estate with the quiet efficiency of men who had done this in 17 other houses across the boroughs. They carried cases that looked like nothing from the outside. Ricci walked at the front. He was 52 years old, a former army engineer, and had worked for the Moretti family for 18 years. He glanced once through the doorway of the study, and his face changed in a way that no man in that hallway would have noticed, except Alessandro. For 22 minutes the team worked in absolute silence. Alessandro stood at the far end of the corridor, one hand resting on the wooden banister, his eyes fixed on the closed door. Beyond the French windows, the thin March rain kept its steady rhythm against the glass, the sound of something patient, something that had all night to fall. Ricci emerged, carrying the device in a foam-lined case. C4, professional grade, 2-channel detonator, tamper-resistant, timer set for 20 minutes, starting at 8 o'clock tonight. His voice was flat, the voice of a man reciting a receipt. If you had begun your meeting on schedule, sir, no one in that room would have survived the opening greeting. Alessandro closed his eyes for one heartbeat. 3 principal allies, 2 senior bosses of the Eastern Seaboard, all of them due to arrive within the next 40 minutes. This was not an assassination aimed at one man. This was a decapitation, an operation designed to erase the entire command structure of the Moretti family in a single evening, in a single room, at a single table. He opened his eyes. His voice remained level. No one hears about this. Not the inner circle, not the third ring. The device goes into the basement safe. No log, no report. Ricci bowed his head. And the investigation, sir? Alessandro looked at him. I will handle it myself. Ricci did not ask again. 18 years had taught him the difference between an order he could question and an order he could not. He gave a single nod, gathered his men with a look, and the 4 of them left through the same service entrance they had entered. 30 minutes later, the estate had returned to the appearance of an ordinary evening. The staff who had been sent to the lower garage under the pretext of an electrical inspection were now being dismissed home early, with apologies and an envelope of cash to soften any curiosity. The guards resumed their positions. The lights burned at the same low warmth. From the outside, it was a house at rest. Alessandro stepped into the study. He did not sit. He did not turn on the overhead chandelier. He allowed the hallway light to spill in through the half-closed door and lay a thin gold line across the floor. The walnut desk stood where it had always stood. It looked exactly as it had that afternoon, the leather-bound folder for tonight's meeting placed neatly at its edge, a heavy fountain pen resting across its cover. The glass of whiskey he had poured before his knees had touched the floor, still untouched, still half full, the ice long since surrendered to the amber. He walked to it. He placed his palm flat against the corner of the wood, spread his fingers, and pressed down. He was not testing its solidity. He was making certain it was still real. Then he raised his eyes to the wall opposite. The oil portrait hung in its heavy gilded frame, where it had hung for 48 years. His father, painted by Sargent's grandson in the winter of 1978, the year before Alessandro was born. In the painting, his father was 34 years old, seated in a leather chair, one hand resting on the arm, the other holding an unlit cigar between two fingers. His eyes looked directly out of the canvas at whoever stood in this room. Tonight, they looked at Alessandro. No one in the estate knew what was behind that painting. Not Tony, not Ricci, not a single guard who had walked past it 10,000 times. Not even Victor, in 15 years of standing at Alessandro's shoulder in this very room, had ever suspected the wall behind that portrait was anything other than plaster and paint. Alessandro's father had built it into the wall 25 years ago. He had never spoken of it, not to his wife, not to his consigliere, not to his son, until the last night of his life, when the morphine had thinned the line between what a dying man remembered and what he needed to pass on. He had gripped Alessandro's wrist with a strength that no 70-year-old man in his final hour should have possessed, and he had whispered 11 words into his son's ear. Alessandro had smiled at those words then. He had believed them the wandering of a mind at the edge of sleep. He was not smiling now. He crossed the room toward the portrait, and the rain kept falling on the glass behind him, patient, unhurried, indifferent to what a man was about to learn about the one direction his heart had never thought to guard. He did not cross to the portrait yet. Instead, he turned back to the desk, picked up the phone he had set down, and made the calls that had to be made before anything else in the house was allowed to move forward. Don Carlo answered on the second ring. Technical trouble at the estate. Tonight is postponed. I will be in contact within 24 hours. Don Carlo was 60 years old. He had known Alessandro's father before Alessandro was born, and he had learned the difference between a voice that invited questions and a voice that closed them. Tonight's voice was the second kind. Understood. Be careful. The line went dead. The second call went to Don Vittorio. The same sentence, the same reply. The old man did not ask what had gone wrong. He heard what he needed to hear in the space between the words, and he let his student handle whatever fire had begun burning on the north shore of Long Island. 3 more calls followed. 3 more allies who had been dressing for dinner, adjusting cufflinks, checking the wine their drivers would carry. 3 more men who put down the phone and quietly told their staff to unpack the evening. Not one of them asked why. Alessandro placed the phone face down on the walnut. He turned his eyes toward the window. The rain had thickened. It was the last rain of March in New York, the rain that always fell hardest in the final week before the city surrendered to spring, and it struck the tall panes of the French window in a steady percussion that sounded, to a man standing alone in a room that had almost become his tomb, like the ticking of something counting backward. He left the study without looking at the portrait a second time. He took the back stairs down to the lower level. The west parlor lay at the end of a short carpeted corridor. Its door was closed. The guard stationed outside, a broad man named Enzo, who had been in the Moretti household 9 years, straightened when he saw Alessandro approach and stepped aside without a word. Alessandro pushed the door open. Maria rose from the couch so quickly that she nearly dropped the small doll she had been holding for her daughter. Her hands went to her apron, smoothing it, then to her hair, then back to her apron. She bowed her head deeply. She did not meet his eyes. She was 31 years old. She had worked in this house for 4 years. She had learned in that time to be invisible, and now that she had been made visible, she believed she was being made visible only in the way a person was made visible before being dismissed. "Sit down, Maria." Alessandro raised his hand gently, palm outward, the way a man might slow a horse. "There is nothing to be afraid of." "The opposite." Maria sat. She did not look up. Sophie was on the sofa beside her, small legs swinging above the carpet, arms wrapped around a rag doll that had lost one of its button eyes years before either mother or daughter had come to work here. The child's blue eyes were on Alessandro now, calm in the way a child's eyes could be calm only when the worst had already happened, and there was nothing left to fear about the next moment. Alessandro crouched in front of her. For a man of his height, in a jacket cut for the boardroom, it was not a graceful movement. But he did it, and he did it slowly, so that his eyes came to rest below the level of the little girl's, and she did not have to look up. "You saw the truest thing in this house tonight," he said softly. "Do you know that?" Sophie considered him for a long moment. She did not answer with words. She nodded slowly, half in understanding, half in trust that if the tall man in the black jacket said a thing was true, then perhaps it was. Alessandro rose to his full height. He turned to Maria. His voice was even, unhurried, without the softness he had used with the child, but also without the weight he used with grown men. "Your daughter saved many lives tonight, Maria. Mine among them. From this evening forward, you and Sophie will be protected for the rest of your lives as members of this family. You will remain here in official employment at 5 times your current wage. Your daughter will attend the finest private school I am able to enroll her in. This is not a request. This is a debt." Maria opened her mouth. No sound came out. Her hand rose to her lips, and the tears began to fall before her mind had fully caught the meaning of what he had said, before she understood that the man standing in front of her had just, in the span of 11 sentences, redrawn the border of her daughter's life and her own. Alessandro turned to Enzo, who had followed him quietly to the doorway. "They stay here tonight. Door locked. No one enters but me. In the morning, take them to the apartment on 68th Street, the one I hold for guests of the family. They remain there until this house is absolutely secure." Enzo bowed his head. Alessandro looked once more at Sophie. The child had not moved. She was still watching him, still holding the one-eyed doll, still with that impossible stillness that had first drawn his eye an hour before. Upstairs, when she had pulled at his sleeve and whispered the words that had cut his life into 2 halves, he did not smile. He was not, tonight, a man who could smile, but he inclined his head to her, a small, formal gesture, the kind a man of another century might have made to a queen, and then he stepped back into the corridor and let the door close behind him. He climbed the back stairs to the 2nd floor. Halfway down the marble hallway, in the strip of gold light thrown by the wall sconces, he stopped in front of the study door. He did not open it. He stood there, one hand near the polished brass handle, his eyes fixed on the wood grain of the door, as though the answer he was afraid to find lay in its whorls and lines rather than in the room beyond it. He needed one moment before he stepped inside, not because he was afraid, because he understood that whatever he was about to do in the next hour would redefine one of 2 things, either his faith in the man he had loved as blood, or his faith in his own eyes. There was no third possibility. There was no answer that would leave both intact. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and turned the brass key in the lock. He had never locked this door before, not when Don Carlo had sat across from him negotiating the surrender of 2 blocks in Bensonhurst, not when Don Vittorio had come to talk about the funeral of a shared friend, not on the night his father died, when he had shut himself in this room for 4 hours with only a bottle and a photograph. In 20 years of the study belonging to him, the key had lived in the drawer, decorative and forgotten. Tonight he turned it, and the small mechanical click sounded louder than it should have. He crossed the room toward the eastern wall. The sergeant portrait hung in its heavy gilded frame, taking up nearly a third of the wall, weighted enough that no cleaner had ever tried to move it. No assistant had ever thought to look behind it. His father sat in that painted chair as he had sat in this real room, spine straight, cigar between 2 fingers, eyes level with any man who dared to look back. Alessandro placed his hand on the lower right corner of the frame and pressed inward, at the exact angle his father had shown him in a bedroom heavy with the smell of medicine and yellow lamps. 3 years ago, the portrait swung out from the wall on a hinge no eye could have found. Behind it lay a flat metal panel set flush into the plaster. No visible lock, no exposed hinge. Only a small pale square in the lower left corner, no larger than a thumbnail, that read the ridges of a fingerprint and matched them against a memory that had been programmed into it a quarter of a century before Alessandro had become a man. He pressed his thumb against the sensor. The panel slid aside without sound. Inside sat a compact wall safe, and, beside it, a hard drive wired to its own uninterrupted power source, a small black box that had drawn silent current from a line that did not appear on any electrical schematic of the estate. 25 years ago, on a summer afternoon that Alessandro could no longer picture, but his father had once described to him in whispered pieces, the old man had installed a camera. It was smaller than a fingernail. It was hidden inside the bronze lion that stood at the corner of the walnut desk, tucked into the hollow behind the animal's left eye, its lens no wider than the pupil of an insect. Only his father had known. Then his father had died, and only Alessandro had known. Not Tony, not Ricci. None of the guards who had walked past that lion 10,000 times and dusted it with cloths passed through their own careful hands. No one in the family, not a single capo, not a single lieutenant, not the accountants who came each quarter, not the priest who had visited on the anniversary of his mother's death, not Victor. In 15 years of standing at Alessandro's shoulder at that desk, Victor had never once suspected that the lion he had joked with, tapped affectionately, placed his own tumbler of scotch beside on winter nights, had been watching him. His father's last words returned to him with the exactness of something that had never truly left. Alessandro. In the study there is an eye that no one knows. Do not ever speak of it, not even to the man you trust most, because the hour will come when you need it, and the man you trust most may be the one you must look at through it. Alessandro had smiled then. He had been 35 years old, kneeling beside the hospital bed, holding the thinned hand of a father whose mind, he believed, had begun to drift on the tide of morphine. He had smiled and squeezed the hand and said, "Rest, Papa." He had believed the words were the wandering of a man whose sentences had begun to leave him. 3 years later, standing in a locked study with rain beating the French windows and a bomb in a basement safe, he was not smiling. He carried the hard drive to the walnut desk, sat down in the leather chair, and connected it to the personal laptop that lived in the top drawer, the one machine in the estate that was never connected to any network the house maintained. He entered the password, 4 layers, 32 characters, drawn from 4 different keyboards, memorized the way a soldier memorized his own name. The drive opened. The files were arranged in a single silent column, 1 file per day, automatically deleted after 30 days. 22 years of daily footage had passed through this system since his father had first activated it, and Alessandro had never watched a single frame. The camera had existed in his mind the way a fire extinguisher existed on a wall, a piece of insurance a man hoped to die of old age before ever needing to reach for. Tonight he had to reach. He opened today's file. He dragged the timeline to the window when the study's official security camera had been turned off for the daily cleaning rotation 3 o'clock in the afternoon to 3:30, a routine so old that no one in the house consciously registered it anymore. The hidden camera in the bronze lion, powered by its own line, tied to no system, invisible to every audit, did not stop. It had not stopped in 25 years. The playback began. For the first 3 minutes, the room was empty. The angle was exactly what he remembered his father describing: a clean, level view, straight across the top of the walnut desk, taking in the door, the chairs, the corners, the shadow beneath the desk itself. No blind spot, no dead ground. At the 4th minute, the door opened. A man stepped into the room. Alessandro paused the video. He did not lean forward. He did not curse. He did not move at all. He sat with his eyes fixed on the frozen frame, and he could not for one long, suspended second permit himself to believe what he was seeing. He rewound the file. He played it again. He watched the door open, watched the man cross the threshold, watched the shoulders enter the frame. He rewound it a second time, played it a second time, rewound, played, a third. But the figure on the screen, the walk he had watched every day for 15 years, the tilt of the shoulders, the way the right hand paused half a beat before the door closed, small unconscious signatures no man could imitate and no man could disguise, did not change through 3 viewings. There was no other way to read it. There was no other man in the world who moved that way. Alessandro sat straight in his father's chair, both hands flat on the walnut, and pressed play a 4th time, not to doubt any more, but to see the whole of it. On the screen, the man closed the door behind him with the softness of a person entering a chapel. He did not lock it. He only pushed it until the latch touched, and then he let his hand fall from the brass. He did not look around the room. That was the first detail that told Alessandro everything. A man committing a crime looked around. A man who had spent 15 years inside these walls, who knew which cameras were switched off at what hour, who had memorized the cleaning rotations because he had personally reviewed the security protocols only 2 months before. That man did not look around. He simply walked forward, into a room he had walked into 1,000 times, on a day like any other, at a moment he had chosen because he had been told to choose it. He crossed to the walnut desk, and then, 2 paces away from it, he stopped. For 2 seconds, he stood perfectly still beside the desk, his head lowered, his shoulders drew tight beneath the fabric of his suit. Alessandro leaned closer to the screen. He recognized the posture. He had seen it once, exactly once in 15 years. In the corridor of Mount Sinai in the autumn of 2015, outside the hospital room where Victor's mother had just stopped breathing, Victor had stood in that same shape for 2 seconds before he pushed open the door and walked in to kiss her forehead one last time. Alessandro had been standing 4 steps behind him. He remembered thinking, at the time, that it looked like the posture of a man who had gone inside himself to find something he could hold on to so his body would not fall. It was the posture of a man breaking open, silently, and refusing to let the break reach his knees. On the screen, Victor Romano lowered himself onto one knee, and then onto both. He reached beneath the walnut desk. From inside his jacket, he drew the device, a rectangular block of C4, sheathed in dull gray wrapping, the detonator already seated. His hands were shaking. Alessandro could see the tremor in the fingers as they worked, small and precise, the way Victor's hands had once shaken in a different room 15 years ago, on the night Alessandro's father had lifted a silver chain from his own neck and placed it around Victor's. But the hands did not stop. He pressed the device into the rear inside corner of the desk, sealed it against the wood with the practiced patience of a man doing something he had been told exactly how to do. He set the timer, 20 minutes, keyed to 8 o'clock. The small red diode began its steady, patient blink. Then Victor lowered his head all the way down to the floor. For 4 seconds, his forehead nearly touched the boards. His shoulders shook. There was no sound on the recording. The hidden camera had no microphone. It had never needed one, but Alessandro did not need sound to understand what he was watching. He had seen shoulders shake in that exact rhythm at his father's coffin. He had seen them shake once more, in the second row of the church. At the funeral of a young capo Victor had loved like a brother. He knew the rhythm of a man who was weeping with everything held inside the chest, so that the throat gave nothing back. Victor was crying. He was crying while he set a bomb to kill the man he had been loyal to for 15 years. Alessandro stopped the video. He did not move. For 40 seconds he sat with his eyes on the frozen screen and did not blink. The rain kept falling on the tall windows behind him. The lamp on the desk cast a small yellow circle around his hands. He had faced 7 assassination attempts in 20 years. He had killed 4 men with his own hands. He had ordered the deaths of 11 others. He had learned, at 12 years old, in this very room, at his father's knee, how to keep his face still while his heart was burning. It had been the first lesson. It had also been the deepest. But tonight, sitting in the room that had almost become his grave, looking at Victor's face on a black screen, the face of the man he had held as blood, the man who had stepped in front of 7 bullets meant for him, the man who had sat with him through the black hours of his father's death and had never once, in 15 years, offered a word he did not mean. Alessandro felt something he had not felt in 20 years. It was not rage. It was not the cold, clean sting of betrayal. It was pain. The kind of pain his father had never taught him how to prepare for. There are betrayals that shock, and there are betrayals that do not shock because they have already been feared, quietly, for years. And then there is a third kind, the betrayal that arrives from the one direction the heart never learned to guard. Alessandro Moretti had built his life to expect the first 2. He had never prepared for the third. He pressed play again. On the screen, Victor rose to his feet. He stood by the desk for a moment, one hand resting lightly on the wood, as though steadying himself. Then he walked to the door. Before he touched the handle, he stopped. He turned his head just slightly, just enough, and looked back at the desk for 2 seconds. The look was not the look of a man admiring his work. It was the look of a man apologizing to a thing he had just placed there. Not to the desk, not to the bomb, to something else, something Alessandro understood without being able to name it, because he had lived beside Victor long enough to read the small, silent movements of that face. Then Victor opened the door and stepped out. The door closed. Alessandro closed the laptop. He sat with his hand resting on its cover. He did not shout. He did not stand. He did not break a single object in the room. There was no glass shattered, no chair overturned, no fist against the wall. He only sat. For 3 minutes. Then he lifted his phone and typed a single line to Tony. Study. Now. Alone. He rose. He carried the laptop across the room, laid it back into the small, hidden safe, slid the metal panel closed, and swung the sergeant portrait back into its place against the wall. His father's painted eyes settled again into their 48-year vigil above the walnut desk. He returned to his chair. He placed both hands flat on the wood, the same wood beneath which Victor had knelt 9 hours before, the same wood beneath which the small red diode had blinked patiently through the afternoon, while Alessandro had adjusted his cufflinks and waited for a meeting that had almost become his last. Tony came in 4 minutes. He entered the study, closed the door softly behind him, and stopped a respectful step short of the desk. His eyes went first to Alessandro's hands, then to his face. There was no laptop on the desk between them. There was no folder open. There was nothing to indicate what had passed in this room in the last 20 minutes, only the quiet and Alessandro's stillness, which Tony had learned to read in 18 years the way a sailor learned to read the color of the sea before a storm. Alessandro did not raise his voice. He said one sentence, in a tone so level it was almost frightening. "Bring Victor here, now." Tony did not sit down. He did not ask what had happened. He stood at his usual station, 3 paces from the desk, hands loose at his sides, and waited. He did not ask because Alessandro's voice had carried a color he had learned to recognize in 18 years of standing in rooms with this man, the color of an order that did not permit discussion. It was not the color of anger. Anger was easier. Anger left room. This voice left none. But there was one thing he still needed to know before he moved. He asked it softly. Cuffs? No cuffs? Alessandro did not look up. His eyes rested on the walnut, on the space between his own two hands, on the wood beneath which a small red diode had been blinking 9 hours ago. No cuffs. No hands laid on him. If he asks, tell him I need to talk about the Brooklyn business. Nothing else. Tony nodded once. How many men? 4. No more. Choose men who can stay quiet. Weapons? Holstered. No one draws unless he moves first. He will not move. Tony nodded again. He waited. He could feel that there was something else, some sentence Alessandro had not yet spoken aloud, and needed to speak aloud, so that saying the word would confirm to himself that the word was true. Alessandro raised his eyes. And in that look, Tony saw something he had not seen in 18 years of standing at this man's shoulder. Not the anger he had witnessed across countless boardroom tables. Not the cold, patient resolve he had watched shape itself in the seconds before a hard decision. Not the practiced control of the boss, the mask he had learned to wear at 12 years old and had worn every day since. He saw something else, something softer, something more painful, and, because of the softness and the pain, something far more dangerous. Alessandro said one word, Victor. Tony did not move a muscle in his face. That was why Alessandro had chosen him tonight, and not any other capo. That was why the message had gone to him and to no one else. Tony had learned, in 18 years, that certain sentences could not be received with an expression that some names, spoken in some rooms, in some voices, were entitled to a face that did not react, but inside his chest, something dropped. It was as if the ground floor of a building had quietly collapsed and left the upper stories still standing, still furnished, still lit but resting on nothing. Victor Romano, the man who had been Alessandro's right hand for 15 years, the man Tony called Fratellino, little brother. Every Christmas dinner in this house, at that same walnut table 3 floors below, glass raised, mouth full of laughter. The man who had stood as the best man at the wedding of Tony's younger sister 7 years ago, in a gray suit Alessandro himself had paid for, and had made a toast that had reduced 2 rows of women to tears. That Victor. Tony drew a slow breath through his nose. Then he asked, in a voice so low Alessandro barely heard it. You are certain? Alessandro did not answer with words. He only held Tony's eyes. That look said, I have seen it with my own eyes. There is no mistake. Tony nodded. He did not ask again. He did not ask how, or where, or through what means Alessandro had come to be certain he knew the boss would not explain. And he knew he did not need to know. Some certainties were the boss's alone to carry, and the men beneath him carried only the orders that came out of that certainty. 35 minutes to Brooklyn, Tony said. 40 back. You will have him at 12:30. Bring him up here. This room. Do not take him to the basement. Not to any of the back rooms. Tony paused for the smallest fraction of a second. This was unusual. The study was where Alessandro received the men who came to negotiate, not the room where interrogations were held. The house had rooms for that. It had always had them. But he did not question it. Understood. He turned and left the study, closing the door quietly behind him. Alessandro was alone again. He rose from his chair. He walked around to the front of the walnut desk, to the side where visitors sat, the side that faced the leather chair he had just left, and he stopped there. He placed both hands flat on the wood, the same wood beneath which, 9 hours earlier, Victor had knelt with trembling fingers and lowered his head to the floor for 4 seconds before pressing a rectangular block of C4 into the far inner corner. He thought about the question he was going to ask. Only 2 words. Why? But the answer might be history. Or the answer might be the thing that redrew every year of the life he had already lived, every dinner he had shared, every gunfight he had walked out of alive, every quiet evening in this room across a bottle of scotch in a silence that had felt, for 15 years, like the safest silence in New York. He had chosen this room. Not the basement, not any of the back rooms. And he had chosen it for a reason he had not yet spoken aloud, not even inside his own head. Because if Victor could not explain if the answer, when it came, was not enough, then Alessandro wanted the last drop of Victor's blood to fall onto the same walnut beneath which Victor had set the bomb. That would be a justice his father would have understood. That would be a justice that closed the circle in the exact place it had been opened. He looked down at his own hands, resting on the wood. The rain outside had not stopped. It fell in the same patient counting rhythm it had fallen in all evening, indifferent to the room, indifferent to the man, indifferent to the car that was, at that moment, pulling away from the estate's north gate with 4 quiet men inside it, heading south across the East River, toward a Brooklyn address where another man was sitting alone in the dark, waiting for the news that would decide whether he ended tonight as a corpse or as something worse. Alessandro lifted his hands from the desk. He crossed to the sideboard, poured a single measure of scotch into a fresh crystal glass, and set it on the wood at the corner nearest to the visitor's chair. Not for himself, for the man who would be sitting there in 58 minutes. 12:27 in the morning. The black SUV rolled to a stop in front of the main gate of the Long Island estate. Alessandro stood at the second-floor window of the study, one shoulder against the wooden frame, and looked down. The rear door of the vehicle opened. Victor stepped out. No cuffs. No barrel pressed against his ribs. He wore what he had been wearing when the four men had knocked on the front door of his Brooklyn brownstone: a plain black wool overcoat, dark trousers, brown leather shoes worn soft at the toes from years of walking these grounds. Ordinary clothing. The clothing of a man who had been about to sit down alone at his kitchen table when he had heard the knock and had understood, before the door had fully opened, that the hour he had been waiting for had come. But the walk was not the walk of the Victor that Alessandro had known. The shoulders were drawn tight. The pace was slow. The head was lowered. That was not the walk of a man rehearsing a defense. That was not the walk of a man who intended to speak. That was the walk of a man who had made his peace with the ground 3 days ago, and was only now arriving at the place he had already, in his own mind, been buried. Alessandro watched him cross the gravel of the front drive. Tony walked half a step ahead. The four men chosen for the escort flanked Victor, two on each side, close enough to prevent flight but not close enough to shame him, their hands empty, their eyes fixed forward. There had been no rough hand laid on him, no word spoken above a murmur, from Brooklyn to Long Island. He had climbed into the SUV of his own accord. He had sat in the middle seat between two of them and looked at his hands for 40 minutes. When the vehicle had turned through the gate, he had raised his eyes once, briefly, to the shape of the house he had loved for 15 years, and then he had lowered them again. Alessandro turned from the window. He walked slowly to the door of the study, unlocked it the second time in one evening that key had been turned in that lock. After 20 years of being decorative, and left the door ajar, he returned to the leather chair behind the walnut desk. He did not sit. He stood behind the chair, one hand resting on its high back, and listened. He heard the front door of the estate open on the ground floor. He heard the soft, disciplined footfall of 6 pairs of shoes crossing the marble of the foyer. At the base of the great staircase, the group stopped. Tony's voice, low, carried up faintly through the height of the atrium. Up. There was a pause. Alessandro could not see what happened in that pause, but he could picture it. Victor raising his head, looking up the flight of white marble, looking at Tony, and those eyes telling Tony that he understood. Not being taken to the basement did not mean this would be lighter. It meant the opposite. Being taken up to the study meant that Alessandro wanted to look him in the eye inside the very room he had betrayed. It meant the boss had not chosen distance. It meant the boss had chosen the closest possible ground, the ground where the betrayal itself had been laid down. Victor began to climb. His footsteps came up through the marble one at a time. Slow, deliberate, not hesitant. Victor Romano had not been a hesitant man in 15 years, but waited, in the way a man carried his weight when he understood that each step might be a step he would never take again. His hand, Alessandro knew without seeing it, would be resting lightly on the polished wooden banister. Not because he needed the support, because he wanted to touch this house one last time, because he had walked up this staircase hundreds of times in 15 years. He had walked up it as a boy of 25 when Alessandro's father was still alive and had summoned him for a first private conversation. He had walked up it on the night Alessandro's father died, carrying a coat that no one had asked him to bring and setting it around Alessandro's shoulders in the corridor without a word. He had walked up it on the morning Alessandro had assumed the seat of the family, 3 days after the funeral, and had stood behind Alessandro's left shoulder in the study, while 3 men in dark suits had knelt to kiss the ring their new dawn wore. Tonight was, perhaps, the last time. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. The 4 escorts followed. Tony led them along the marble corridor of the second floor. The wall sconces threw their soft gold light. No one spoke. They stopped in front of the study door. Tony knocked twice light, in the small, precise rhythm known only to the inner circle, the rhythm that told the man on the other side of the door who was standing on this one. The door opened from the inside. Alessandro had crossed the room to open it himself. He stood in the doorway, one hand still on the brass, and he looked at Victor. For half a second, neither of them moved. Their eyes met. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be said. In that half-second past the entirety of 15 years, the gunfights survived together. The funerals endured beside one another. The The christenings, the weddings, the quiet nights across a table in this very room, when the whole world had been elsewhere, and only the two of them had remained inside a silence that had, until 9 hours ago, been the safest silence Alessandro had ever known. Then Alessandro stepped aside. Inside, Victor walked in. Alessandro turned to Tony and the 4 men in the corridor. His voice was quiet, without ceremony. Outside, stand in the hall, door closed. No one enters until I call, not even if you hear something. Tony hesitated for the length of half a breath. Then he lowered his head. Understood. The 4 men stepped back. Tony pulled the door shut with the same care he had used the entire evening, and the brass handle settled into place with a small final click. Alessandro and Victor were alone, in the very room where, 9 hours earlier, Victor had knelt on the floor with a block of gray C4 inches his shaking hands. Victor stood in the middle of the room, beside the walnut desk. He did not move. He did not look down at the space beneath the desk. He knew exactly where the device had been placed, and he knew exactly that it was no longer there. His eyes did not need to confirm what his hands had done 9 hours before. He only looked at Alessandro. Alessandro walked to the leather chair behind the walnut desk. He sat down. He placed both hands, palms flat, on the surface of the wood, the same wood beneath which Victor had lowered his head to the floor and wept for 4 seconds before setting a timer for 20 minutes. He looked at Victor. His voice rose from somewhere deep beneath the boss he had been for 20 years. Not the voice of authority, not the voice of judgment, but the voice of a man who was being cut open by the answer he was about to receive, whether he received it in words or in silence. Why? Victor did not answer. He looked down at the surface of the walnut desk. His hands, resting at his sides, closed slowly into fists against the fabric of his trousers. His shoulders did not move. His breath did not change. He simply stood there, in the middle of the room, and let the question settle into the air between them the way a stone settled into deep water. 40 seconds passed. Alessandro did not push. He sat straight in the black leather chair, the chair his father had occupied for 30 years, the chair he himself had occupied for 20, and his hands remained flat on the wood before him. He had learned patience in this room at the age of 12. He had learned it from a man who had understood that silence, correctly held, could pull the truth out of a mouth more surely than any blade. Tonight he held that silence for a different reason. He was not extracting a confession. He already knew what had been done. He was giving the man he had loved as blood the chance to say it in his own voice, in his own time, in the room where it needed to be said. The rain continued against the tall French windows. It had thinned in the last hour, no longer the hard percussion of 10 o'clock, but the patient, even rain of the small hours, the rain that fell as if it had nowhere else to be for the rest of the night. At last, Victor's voice found its way up out of his throat. It was hoarse, the voice of a man who had not swallowed water in 30 hours, who had spoken to no one but himself since the first video had arrived on the burner phone. You found out. I knew you would. I have been waiting. Alessandro's reply came softly. That is not what I asked. Victor nodded once. He still did not look up. I know. His eyes went to the desk, to the same walnut beneath which he had knelt 9 hours before. For a single moment his gaze fixed on one specific spot, the rear inside corner, precisely where his shaking fingers had pressed the block of C4 against the wood grain. There was no mark there now. The disposal team had scraped and cleaned and swept and left no trace that any human eye could see. But Victor's eye was not any human eye. He had put the thing there with his own hand, and he saw the invisible black stain of it as clearly as if it were still bleeding into the wood. He walked forward. He came around the front of the desk to the visitor's chair, the leather-upholstered seat where partners sat when they came here to negotiate. He did not sit. He would not permit himself, in this moment, in this room, to occupy a chair equal in height to the one his boss occupied. Instead, he continued past it. He walked to the side of the walnut desk, to the same side, to the same corner, and there, on the polished wood floor, in the exact place where 9 hours ago he had knelt to lay a bomb, he lowered himself to his knees a second time. No one had forced him. No one was standing over him. The 4 guards were on the other side of a closed door. Tony was in the corridor. The house was silent around them. There was no witness in this room but Alessandro and the painted eyes of Alessandro's father watching down from the wall. Victor knelt because he had chosen to kneel. Alessandro watched him lower himself. He said nothing. He waited. Victor placed both hands on his thighs, palms flat, and lifted his head. He looked directly across the desk into Alessandro's eyes. His own were full of water, but the water did not fall. He was holding it back with the kind of will that only a man who had lived 15 years in this world could possess. That will had been forged in this house. It would not break here, not now. He spoke. His voice was low, but it was steady. Alessandro, I am not asking for forgiveness. I am not asking for mercy. I know I have to die. Your father taught me from the first day my blood is Moretti blood, and if I betray, I am to cut my own throat before the Moretti has to do it. He paused. He drew a slow breath. Then he continued. I did not cut my own throat because I need 24 more hours. After that, you can kill me by your own hand in this room, beside this desk. That is fair. I will not resist. I will help you if you want. I will show you where to cut. I will keep my eyes on you, so you do not have to look at me when it is done. Alessandro did not move. He did not answer. Victor looked at him, and for the first time since he had entered the study, his voice cracked only a hairline, only one small fracture along a single sentence. But before that, I need you to hear one thing. One, this is not a defense. This is not for me to live. This is so that you know the truth before you decide. The silver crucifix under Victor's collar caught the light of the desk lamp as he shifted his shoulders, the crucifix Alessandro's father had lifted from his own neck 15 years ago and placed around Victor's. In this room, on a summer evening that both of them remembered in the exact same detail, from opposite sides of the walnut, Alessandro's eyes went to the silver, then back to Victor's face. He did not ask Victor why he had needed 24 more hours. He did not need to ask. He had seen, on the hidden footage, the moment Victor had lowered his head for 4 seconds to the floor before pressing the device into place, and in that moment, watching alone in this room 3 hours ago, he had already understood. Whatever Victor had done, Victor had not done as a traitor. Whatever had driven him to kneel beneath this desk had not come from within him. It had come from outside, and it had come with a weight heavier than 15 years of loyalty. He only needed Victor to speak the truth aloud. Both of them needed that, so that the ground beneath what came next could be true ground, and not the assumption of one man's mercy laid over the silence of another. Alessandro drew a slow breath through his nose. He did not lean forward. He did not soften his eyes. He held the same stillness he had held for the last 3 minutes. Then he said, quietly, "Speak." Victor did not begin at once. He held the word Alessandro had just given him in his throat like a coin he was not yet ready to spend. His eyes went down to the floor between his own knees. His hands remained on his thighs. Alessandro let him keep the silence a moment longer. Then he asked the second question, the one that would collapse the entire wall between them the instant it was answered. What is it that you need 24 more hours for? Victor looked up. He did not answer immediately. He knew the moment the answer left his mouth, everything would change. There would be no further ground to retreat to. Every word after it would be built on that first sentence, or on the ruin of it. He spoke, softly but clearly, to save Elena, to save Lucia. Alessandro had known. From the 4 seconds of Victor's bowed head on the hidden footage, he had known. From the tremor in Victor's hands, as they had pressed the C4 into the wood, from the 2-second backward glance Victor had given the desk before leaving the room, all of it had told him the same thing hours ago, in the silence of an empty study, watching a screen with the rain against the window. But hearing it now from Victor's own mouth, in the same room, across a distance of 5 feet was not the same. It struck a place in his chest that no piece of video could reach. Something there tightened and refused to loosen. He did not let it show on his face. He rose from the black leather chair. He walked around the front of the walnut desk, past the corner where Victor had knelt to place the bomb 9 hours ago, past the corner where Victor was kneeling now, and he crossed the last 2 paces of polished wood floor until he stood directly in front of the kneeling man. He did not kneel, but he bent a slow, controlled bend at the waist and the knees, deep enough that his eyes came level with Victor's eyes. He placed his right hand on Victor's shoulder. The weight of it was not the weight of judgment, it was the weight of a brother. "Stand up." Victor shook his head. "No, Alessandro, I will tell you kneeling. I am not worthy to stand in this room." Alessandro's hand tightened on the shoulder. Not hard, but with an authority that would not be argued with. He lifted. Victor did not resist. He had no strength left to resist, no will to. His knees trembled as he came upright, and for a moment he swayed, and Alessandro's other hand came up beneath his elbow to steady him. Only then did Victor stand fully. Alessandro walked him 3 steps to the leather visitor's chair, the chair he had passed by on his own, refusing to sit in. Alessandro turned him with a light pressure at the shoulder and eased him down into it. Victor sat. Then Alessandro did a thing that no one, not Tony, Not Ricci, not any lieutenant, not any capo, not any partner or ally or enemy in 20 years had ever seen him do inside this study. He did not return to his father's chair behind the desk. Instead, he crossed the room to the corner where a single unmatched armchair stood, a chair the housekeeper had left there years ago and never bothered to move. A chair no visitor ever used, and he lifted it, carried it back across the room, and set it down directly facing Victor. On Victor's side of the desk, not on the boss's side. He sat. Level, not higher. There was no walnut between them anymore. No polished plane of authority. No desk on which one man's hand rested and another man's did not. He looked at Victor. Victor, look at me. Victor raised his eyes. Slowly. You said saving Elena and Lucia is the only thing you ask for. Good. I agree now before you have told me anything. Whatever the reason, whatever you have done, I will bring them home. That is a promise. It is not conditional on what you say next. Victor closed his eyes. The tears he had been holding since the moment he had entered this room finally fell. Not many. Only 2. They slid down slowly, one along each side of his face. And they did not seem to belong to a grown man. They seemed to belong to someone much younger, someone who had been holding something for far longer than 3 days. Alessandro let him keep those 2 tears. He did not look away from them. Then he spoke again, and his voice was low, but there was steel beneath it now. But there is something you have to understand. I am not going to kill you afterward. I am not going to agree to that part of your terms. You will tell me everything from the beginning, and I will decide afterward not by the law my father taught me, but by what I know of you from 15 years. Victor opened his eyes. Alessandro, no. Listen. Alessandro's tone did not rise, but it did not permit interruption. My father taught me, betrayal is betrayal. There is no reason. And in his own life, that was true. Because in his own life he was never made to choose between the family and the person he loved. He died before he ever had to face that question. I am facing it right now in this room, beside this desk, and I will not decide until I have heard everything. Victor nodded. Slowly, something in his shoulders went down by an inch, and did not come back up. Alessandro did not take his hand from Victor's shoulder. He kept it there, a steady, warm weight, and his voice softened into something Victor had not heard from him in 12 years. Not the voice of the boss. Not the voice of the man who ran the eastern seaboard. The voice of the older brother he had been, once, before this house had begun to bury its softer voices under the burden of the seat. Tell me, from the beginning, all of it. Victor drew in a breath. His chest rose and shook. Then he began. But he did not begin with Tuesday afternoon. He did not begin with the moment his phone had lit up in a Brooklyn meeting room, or with the photograph, or with the voice on the other end of the 6 o'clock call. He began with something Alessandro had not been expecting at all. Alessandro, first, I need you to know something. I have loved Elena since the day she was a waitress at Sal's, from the very first day, before she knew my name. If I do not say that to you now, and tonight I die before I see her again, I need you to say it to her. For me, Alessandro felt something tighten inside his ribs. He nodded, slowly. I will tell her. But you will tell her first. Victor kept going. His voice was still hoarse, but it was steadier now, as though the act of releasing the first sentence had loosened the lock on every sentence behind it. Lucia is 8 years old. She likes to draw. She drew a picture of you and me and your father standing next to each other. She has never even met your father. She only knows him from the way I have talked about him, and she put it on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a strawberry. If I die tonight, I need you to keep that drawing. Do not let Elena throw it away when she is going through my things. It took her 3 weeks to finish. She kept starting over because she could not remember what color your father's eyes were, and I would not tell her, because I wanted her to decide. Alessandro nodded. I will keep it. Victor's eyes had not yet touched Alessandro's. He was looking at some point between them, at the wooden floor, at the middle distance where a man sees the faces of the people he loves when he is far from them. Elena is afraid of the dark. From the time she was 6, her father used to lock her in a storeroom behind their apartment when she did anything wrong. Once he left her there 2 nights, because she had lost a nickel. She has never told anyone. Only me. Even now, she keeps the hallway light on when she sleeps. After tonight, do not let her sleep alone in a dark house. If I do not come back, send her to my mother in Queens. My mother will leave every light in the apartment on all night for her. My mother has done it before, when Elena has stayed there. She will not ask questions. Alessandro listened. He did not interrupt, but his fingers, out of Victor's sight, closed around the arm of the borrowed chair until the knuckles went white, and none of it reached his face. This was not a man bargaining. This was not a man pleading. This was a man giving his last will and testament in fragments, from memory, without paper, item by item, each item small enough that a lesser listener would have thought it trivial. Each item was, in fact, unbearable, because each item was proof that Victor Romano had lived for 3 days with the certainty of his own death, and inside those 3 days he had thought through every small thing he would leave behind, in the order of the people who would miss it. Victor breathed in again. His voice did not shake yet, but it was thinning. "The cross your father gave me. Give it back to Lucia. Tell her that the godfather she never met wore it before her father did. Tell her that her father tried to live worthy of it for 15 years and failed once. At the end. Do not defend me. Do not soften it. Just tell her the truth. When she is old enough to understand, she will understand. My daughter is smart. She will not need it dressed up." Alessandro cut in. "You will hang it around her neck yourself. On the day of her wedding." Victor lifted his eyes for the first time and looked directly at him. There was something in his gaze that flickered not hope. He did not permit himself hope. He had spent 3 days making himself unable to hope, but something adjacent to it. Something that had lived just underneath hope for those 3 days without a name. "If you are kind enough to let me live until that day," he said quietly. Alessandro did not answer that. He did not want to answer it yet. He had made his decision hours ago in this room, alone, watching a screen. But the decision needed a floor of truth beneath it, before it could be spoken aloud. And the floor was still being laid, sentence by sentence, in Victor's own voice. "Go on," Alessandro said. "Tuesday afternoon." Victor nodded. He drew in one more breath deeper this time. The breath of a man preparing to walk into a room he had walked out of 3 days ago, and had been walking out of, over and over, every hour since, and he began at the beginning. He began with the phone call at 3 o'clock. And the ordinary voice of his wife telling him she would be home before 5, and the last thing she had said to him before she had hung up, which had been the same thing she always said, before she hung up, 5 words that he had heard thousands of times in 9 years of marriage, and had never, until this week, understood were the kind of words a man could hear for the last time on any given afternoon without knowing. He told it plainly, without dressing. As he spoke, Alessandro did not move, not once. He did not shift in the borrowed chair. He did not glance at the walnut desk. He did not look at the tall French windows where the rain kept its patient rhythm. He kept his eyes on Victor's face, and he kept his hand where it had been for the last several minutes, resting lightly on the shoulder of a man who was giving him a widow's testimony from inside a still-living body. The silver crucifix beneath Victor's collar caught the lamplight every time his chest rose to breathe. It rose. It fell. It rose again. And Alessandro knew with the same private certainty he had carried since the hidden footage had ended 3 hours before, that the decision had already been made. It had been made in the 4 seconds of Victor's bowed head on that recording. It had been made in the moment Victor had knelt a second time in this room without being asked. It had been made in the sentence about the hallway light in Queens. He only needed Victor to finish speaking, so that the justice he was going to deliver would rest on ground made entirely of truth, and not 1 inch of it on assumption. He let his hand stay where it was. He let Victor keep talking. He began at 3 o'clock on Tuesday. His voice was flat now, the voice of a man reading from a report he had been forced to memorize, one that no longer sounded to him like it belonged to his own life. Elena had called from the sidewalk on Mulberry Street. It had been an ordinary Tuesday. She and Lucia had gone to Little Italy the way they always went to Little Italy on Tuesdays, to the small grocery 3 doors down from the bakery, to buy the ingredients for the lasagna she made every Sunday. It was Victor's favorite meal. She had been making it for him for 9 years. She had told him she was picking up ricotta and San Marzano tomatoes, and Lucia had asked to stop at the toy shop on the corner, and Elena had promised her 10 minutes and no more. She had said she would be home before 5. She had ended the call the way she always ended calls with him. "I love you. Come home early." He had never counted, in 9 years of marriage, how many times he had heard those 5 words. If she had asked him at the beginning of that week, he would have said several thousand. He would not have said they were the kind of words a man could hear for the last time on any ordinary Tuesday afternoon without knowing. At 4:25 in the afternoon, he had been sitting in a small conference room above a shipping office on Court Street, listening to 5 capos discuss the price structure of the Brooklyn docks. His phone had lit up on the table, an unknown number, not a call, a message, a single photograph attached. Elena was tied to a wooden chair. Her eyes were bound with a black cloth. She was sitting in a room he did not recognize, bare walls, a single overhead bulb, the floor of a place that had once been an industrial storeroom and had not been swept in years. Beside her sat Lucia. His daughter was wearing the pink cardigan Alessandro had given her the previous Christmas, the one with the small pearl buttons that Elena had had to sew back on twice because Lucia refused to take it off even to sleep. Lucia's face was the color of paper. Her mouth was covered with tape. Her small wrists were tied to the arms of a chair too large for her. Beneath the photograph was one line of text. Wait for the call. Tell no one. If this phone is switched off, or if you contact anyone, both of them are dead in 10 minutes. Victor described the moment to Alessandro without decoration. He had sat in that room for another 20 minutes, surrounded by 5 men of the Moretti family, who were arguing about the tariff on olive oil shipments and laughing over an anecdote from a warehouse in Red Hook. He had kept his face still. He had nodded at the right places. He had answered when he was addressed, and later he would not be able to remember a single word he had said. He had used the 20 years he had spent in this life, and the 15 years he had spent at Alessandro's shoulder, and every lesson Alessandro's father had ever taught him about how to keep his face empty, and he had used all of it, in one long, silent expenditure, to survive that 20 minutes. When the meeting had ended, he had walked to the men's room on the second floor of the shipping office. He had locked the stall. He had sat on the closed lid of the toilet for 4 minutes, with the burner photograph phone in his hand. And he had thought, very carefully, about who he could call Alessandro. Tony, the capo across the table who had loved him as an uncle, the priest at St. Anthony's, his own mother in Queens, and he had understood, one name at a time, that any single call would kill both of them in 10 minutes. He had understood also that whoever was watching him well enough to know when a phone was off, which meant he was being watched now, at that moment, in the second-floor men's room of a Court Street shipping office. He had stood up. He had walked out. He had bought a burner phone, in cash, at a bodega on Atlantic Avenue, because the message had told him to. The call came at 6:08 in the evening. The voice on the other end did not introduce itself. It did not need to. Victor recognized it inside the first 2 syllables. He had sat across a table from it twice in the last year, at 2 of the periodic sit-downs between the Eastern families. He had watched it smile behind a tumbler of imported grappa. Leonardo Russo, the head of the Russo family, the Moretti's principal rival for 2 years running, a man who had wanted the Eastern Seaboard for a decade and had made no secret of it. Leonardo had made 3 demands. 1. A block of military-grade C4 was to be placed in Alessandro Moretti's private study, beneath the walnut desk, before 8 o'clock on Friday night. The device would be delivered to Victor by disguised courier on Thursday evening. He would receive detonation instructions with it. 2. Victor was to speak to no one. Not a phrase at his own dinner table about feeling unwell. Not a note written and torn up. Not a single behavior that would allow Alessandro to sense, at even 1%, that something was wrong. 15 years of a face Alessandro could read in his sleep, and Victor was to hold that face perfectly still for 3 days. 3. Victor was to report twice a day, at 6:08 in the evening and 11 at night, by calling back on the burner. Each call was to consist of a single coded phrase, memorized. If a report was missed, if the timing was off by more than 4 minutes, the punishment would be visible in the next video. In exchange, after the bomb detonated and Alessandro was confirmed dead, Elena and Lucia would be released unharmed within 2 hours, at an address in Queens. Victor had not believed it. He had known in the same 3 seconds it took Leonardo to finish the 3rd condition that the release would never happen. Leonardo Russo did not leave witnesses. He did not leave loose ends. 2 women who had spent 72 hours inside his safe house would not be returned to walk the streets of New York and speak about what they had seen. But he had also known, in the same 3 seconds, that a small chance was a chance, and that no chance at all was no chance at all. And he had chosen the small chance. He told Alessandro next about the videos. Every 2 hours, for 3 days, a new video had arrived on the burner phone, 37 in total. He had watched each one. He had to, because Leonardo had built the instructions into the videos themselves, small operational details buried in the last 30 seconds of each recording, adjustments to timing, to courier drop points, to the shape of the report he was to give at the next call. Missing one video meant missing one instruction. Missing one instruction meant one of Lucia's fingers. That had been the rule. Leonardo had said it once, at the end of the first call, in the same tone a man might use to describe the terms of a business lease. Alessandro listened. He did not interrupt. His fingers, resting on the arm of the borrowed chair, had gone completely white around the wood. His face did not move. Victor reached inside the breast pocket of his black wool coat. He took out the burner phone, small, cheap. its plastic casing scratched in one corner from being dropped on a Brooklyn kitchen floor at some point in the last 3 nights. He set it down on the walnut desk between them, on the same wood beneath which, 9 hours earlier, he had knelt to press a block of gray C4 into the inside corner. He looked at Alessandro. His voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of a man who had emptied himself of everything except one final sentence. You do not have to watch all of them. But if you need to see, they are there. All 37. I did not delete a single one. I did not dare. Alessandro reached out and picked up the burner phone from the walnut. It was light, cheap, the kind that was purchased in cash and thrown away in a river. A cracked corner, fingerprints on the screen that would tell nothing. He tapped the display awake. There was no password. Leonardo had forbidden Victor to set one so that at any moment, without warning, he could demand a screenshot of any folder, any conversation, any file, and receive it within 30 seconds. Privacy had been the first thing taken. The video folder opened at his touch. 37 files, arranged in chronological order, time-stamped down to the minute. Each icon showed a tiny frozen frame no larger than a thumbnail. He did not need to enlarge them to know what they contained. He did not open all 37, but he opened enough. The first Tuesday afternoon, 4:20 in the afternoon, Elena was tied to the same wooden chair he had seen in the still photograph. Her face was still whole. There were no bruises yet. Her jaw was set. Her breath was coming through her nose in short, furious pulls, and even with the black cloth over her eyes, Alessandro could see the shape of the woman she was, the woman he had known for 9 years, the woman who had stood at the top of a church staircase in a white dress and had reached out to grip his sleeve for balance a moment before she had walked down the aisle to Victor. The woman in that first video was awake. She was angry. She was still fighting. The 10th Wednesday morning, something had changed. There was a purple swelling closing her left eye. Her lower lip was split. The angle of her shoulders was different, a woman who has stopped bracing against what is coming and has begun instead to conserve. She was no longer fighting. Her head was down. Her fingers, still bound to the arms of the chair, were no longer moving. The 27th Thursday afternoon, she was whispering to someone off camera. The words came out through the swelling of her mouth, thick and uneven. My love, do not do it. Do not do it for me. Do not do it for our daughter. Alessandro is your brother. Do not. The sound of the slap cut her off. Her body pitched sideways in the chair. The camera stopped. The 34th Friday at noon. Today, 9 hours ago. Lucia, alone. The 8-year-old girl in the pink cardigan sat in a chair too large for her, the tape gone from her mouth this time. Her small hands were still bound. Her hair was tangled. The man off camera held a knife with a black handle. He did not cut her. He only rested the flat of the blade against her cheek slowly, carefully, letting the cold of the metal reach her skin, letting her feel exactly what it was and exactly what it could do. She was crying so hard her whole small body was shaking. Baba, please, I want to go home. Baba. Alessandro set the burner phone down on the walnut desk. He did not watch the remaining 3 videos. He did not speak. He could not speak. His fingers had closed around the edge of the borrowed chair with the strength of a man who did not know he was tightening them, and the knuckles beneath the skin had gone white. But his face did not move. He had been trained not to let it move at 12 years old. In this same room, by his father, and the training held under fire in the way it had been designed to hold, because if the face went, the man went with it, and the man was needed for what came next. But his eyes, for half a second before he pulled the boss's control back down over them, half a second. No more, his eyes gave Victor something no man in this house had ever seen in 20 years. They gave him the sight of the man beneath. They gave him the rupture. Victor lowered his head. He did not wait for a verdict. He spoke quietly, and now his voice was neither steady nor performative. It was the voice of a man releasing what he had been carrying alone for 3 days. 3 days. 37 videos. I have not slept. I have not eaten. On the second night, I stood in our bedroom with a pistol in my hand and thought about putting it under my chin. I did not do it. I could not do it. Leonardo told me on the first call, if I die before the job is done, Elena and Lucia die within the hour. He stopped. He drew a breath that did not fill his chest. Then his voice broke completely. He kept going anyway. This afternoon, when the house closed the study for 30 minutes for the cleaning rotation, I came up the stairs. The device had arrived by parcel last night. I put it under the desk, this desk, the one right next to my knee now. I armed the detonator. I set the timer for 20 minutes, keyed to 8 o'clock. Then I walked out. I went down the back stairs. I sat in my own car in the garage. I waited. Loyalty is not a promise made once and framed on a wall. It is a debt that either party can be forced to renegotiate at any hour of any night. The question is never whether the loyal will stay loyal. The question is what the enemy is willing to hold hostage and how long the loyal can endure before something inside them finally breaks. Alessandro rose from the borrowed chair. He walked to the tall French window. He did not speak. He stood with his back to Victor and his hand flat against the cold glass. And outside, the March rain kept striking the pane in the same patient rhythm it had kept for hours. Behind him, in the visitor's chair, Victor sat with his head bowed. The silver crucifix beneath his collar caught the lamplight each time his chest rose to breathe. It rose. It fell. It rose again. Alessandro stood there for a long moment. Then he turned. He crossed the polished floor back to Victor. He did not sit down again. He stopped in front of the chair and looked down at the man sitting in it. And in his eyes there was no longer a boss. There was only the older brother he had once been, and had almost let himself forget how to be. There was no verdict on his face. There was no forgiveness spoken. There was no sentence handed down. He simply reached out his hand. He took Victor by the upper arm and lifted him out of the chair. Firm, steady, the way a man lifted a brother who had fallen. And he said the 3 words Victor had not permitted himself, in 3 days, to dream of hearing. "We are going." Alessandro did not remove his hand from Victor's arm. He kept it there, a firm, steady grip on the upper shoulder, for a full 10 seconds. He held on the way a brother holds a brother who has just been pulled out of deep water and has not yet remembered how to stand on his own weight. Victor did not speak. He did not need to. The tremor had begun to go out of his legs. The silver crucifix beneath his collar rose and fell in a slower rhythm now. Then Alessandro turned, crossed the room, and pulled open the study door. Tony was standing exactly where he had been placed, 3 paces down the hall, out of sight of the doorway, close enough to be summoned by a raised voice, far enough to hear nothing that had passed inside. The 4 escorts stood at the far end of the corridor, hands folded, eyes forward. None of them turned their heads as the door opened. Tony, inside. Tony crossed the threshold. He closed the door behind him with the same care he had used every time he had entered this room in 18 years. Then he saw them. Victor was standing beside the walnut desk, not kneeling, not restrained. The silver crucifix was still around his neck. His shoulders were still lowered, but no longer collapsed. Alessandro's hand was no longer on him. It was resting on the surface of the desk, but the space between the 2 men had rearranged itself in the last 20 minutes into something Tony did not need to be told. The meaning of Tony did not ask. He waited. Alessandro's voice, when it came, was low and even. Victor is not a traitor. Elena and Lucia are being held by Leonardo Russo, in the Bronx. We have 6 hours before sunrise to bring them home. Prepare a full strike team. Tonight. Tony did not blink. He had learned in 18 years that a boss's order arrived in one of 2 forms, the form that permitted questions, and the form that did not. Tonight's order was the second. He nodded once. How many men? 16. No one from outside the family. There is no time to screen for a second betrayal. Full ordnance, Bronx maps, thermal optics, body armor, breach grade C4 for a steel door. A medevac helicopter staged 2 kilometers off the objective, running hot, direct to Mount Sinai. Dr. Rossi meets it there. Have him told inside the next 10 minutes. Tony committed each item to memory in the order Alessandro had spoken them. He did not ask about Leonardo. He did not ask about the rules of engagement. Both had been made clear by the sentence, "Bring them home." Understood. He crossed the room, opened the door, and left. Alessandro turned back to the walnut. Rolled across its surface now was a wide, folded map of the Bronx, one of the tactical maps kept in the basement of the estate, laminated, marked with the old boundaries and utility lines of a borough Alessandro had not personally walked in 12 years. One of the 3 loyal capos had carried it up during the last stretch of Victor's testimony, and had laid it there without speaking a word. And Alessandro had not looked up to acknowledge him. The map had waited beside the burner phone until now. Alessandro spread it flat with the heel of his hand. Victor stepped forward. There was a hesitation in him at first, the last remnant of the man who, 5 minutes earlier, had been kneeling beside this same desk, waiting to be executed against it. Then the hesitation passed, and the operator returned. He put one finger on the map, on a stretch of industrial waterfront in the South Bronx, and began to speak. He described the safe house. He described how he had come to know it piece by piece. In 3 days of listening for anything Leonardo did not mean to give away. A remark about the smell of iron in the walls. A stray reference to the eastern basement in one of the later videos. the sound of water dripping through pipes in the background of a call, the rhythm of a subway line audible only in one narrow slice of the Bronx, an old munitions warehouse from the Second World War, converted decades later into a Russo staging facility. 3 floors, 6 ways in, 2 subterranean egress tunnels through the storm sewer system, at least 20 armed men, probably more tonight, given how close Leonardo believed himself to be to victory. The holding cell for Elena and Lucia was in the eastern basement, near the shell of an old water storage tank. Leonardo, in one of the middle calls, had set it near the old water tank, eastern side. Keep them dry without thinking. Victor had held that sentence in his head for 2 days. There was a sewer service tunnel that ran into that basement from the east. Alessandro listened. He asked short questions and received short answers. He committed each detail to the same silent library of the mind where he had, 20 years ago, learned to store the words of dying men and the layouts of buildings he might one day have to burn. But while Victor's finger traveled the paper, Alessandro's mind was traveling something else. It was traveling 15 years. The Brooklyn warehouse in the summer of 2009, Victor at 25, stepping between Alessandro and 3 shooters from the Falcone crew. A round taking him high in the shoulder, he had not made a sound. He had turned his own body into a corner and had returned fire until Alessandro had cleared the wall. The Queen's explosion in the autumn of 2013. Victor, one leg broken from a falling beam, carrying Alessandro 2 kilometers across railway ground with his own weight on the wrong side of gravity, refusing to set him down until they reached the pickup point. The Manhattan funeral in the winter of 2018. Alessandro's mother's requiem at St. Patrick's. Victor standing at Alessandro's left through the entire ceremony, saying nothing, doing nothing but being there, for 4 hours, without breath or drink, so that Alessandro would not have to receive the condolences of 200 men alone. The Long Island funeral 3 years ago, Alessandro's father Victor sitting beside him in the dark cathedral, long after every other mourner had gone, not speaking, not moving, waiting silently until at last, at some hour past midnight, Alessandro had permitted himself the tears he had refused to shed in front of the family. There was no betrayal inside those 15 years. Not one moment. Not one gesture. Not one small drift of loyalty in the direction of another house. There had been only one night 3 days ago, when a man had been placed in front of a choice that was not a choice. 15 years of the family that had raised him from the street. Or the wife he had loved for 30 years and the daughter he had held on the day of her baptism with his hands still trembling from the water. There was no right answer to that question. Alessandro understood. He looked down at the map, then at Victor. He folded the paper along its center creases with the slow precision of a man who did not want to tear it, and he set it aside. "You go through the door first," he said quietly. "I follow." No argument. Victor lifted his head. He did not argue. He only nodded. Once. And beneath his collar the silver crucifix, the one Alessandro's father had lifted from his own neck 15 years ago in this same room, caught the lamplight and held it. 9:30 in the morning by the clock, but outside the tall French windows the world was still black, held under by the rain that had refused to lift since the previous afternoon. In the 4 hours since Tony had first walked out of the study, the Long Island estate had ceased to be a house. It had become a command post. Tony had assembled the inner circle in the study. 3 capos, the 3 whose loyalty Alessandro had chosen to stake his life on tonight without a second thought. 12 soldiers, personally vetted by Tony inside the hour, each one drawn from the small pool of men who had served the family long enough that a betrayal on their part would have already come to the surface. 16 in total, with Alessandro and Victor, 18. The Bronx map was open on the walnut desk. The same map Victor had traced with a fingertip 4 hours earlier. The corners were held down now by 2 glass tumblers, an empty ashtray, and a fountain pen. Alessandro stood at the head of the desk, both palms flat on the wood. Victor stood beside him, not behind, not at his shoulder, beside at equal height, at equal distance from the map, close enough that any man in the room who understood the geometry of authority in this house understood also that a decision had been made, and that whatever Victor Romano had done or not done in the last 72 hours, he was standing tonight in the position he had always stood in. Alessandro spoke without preamble. His finger moved on the paper as he assigned. Team A, Tony leads. 4 men. You take the front. You make noise. You draw fire toward the main entrance and you hold it there. Automatic weapons. Thermal optics. You do not push past the first 2 rooms. I want you loud. I do not want you dead. Tony inclined his head. Team B, Marco leads. 5 men. You circle east. Cut the main power feed to the building. Kill the camera system. and hold the rear service door open for our exit. When the lights go dark, you have 3 minutes to blind every eye in that facility." Marco, 38 years old, a former Marine, the man who had lifted Alessandro out of the wreckage of the Queen's explosion beside Victor 12 years ago, gave a single hard nod. "Team C, myself, Victor, 2 men." Alessandro's finger left the front of the map and traced a thin line along the storm sewer that ran east into the industrial parcel. "We enter through the eastern drainage tunnel. Straight to the basement, straight to the holding room where Elena and Lucia are being kept. We do not stop to engage. We take them, we come out through the same tunnel, and we do not fire around. We do not absolutely have to fire until they are behind us." He raised his eyes to the room. "Tonight is not ordinary work. This is war. If any man here is not ready to die for it, say it now. There is no judgment in it. Say it and step out. You will not be marked." No one spoke. The 3 capos stood still. The 12 soldiers stood still. Tony's face did not move. Marco's face did not move. Alessandro nodded once. "Prepare. Vehicles depart at 10:30. The men filed out of the study without a word. Boots on marble. Then boots down the great staircase. Then the muffled activity of the lower floors as the estate's armory began to be opened for the second time in its history. The door closed behind the last of them. Alessandro and Victor were alone. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Alessandro reached down to the leather sheath at his right hip, the sheath that had ridden on his belt inside his jacket every day for 20 years, unseen by anyone who did not know to look for it. He drew the knife. 6 inches of Damascus steel. The pattern in the metal caught the desk lamp and threw it back in shifting bands of dark and light. The handle was carved horn, worn smooth at the grip by 2 generations of use. On the underside of the pommel, cut so deeply that no polish had ever softened it, was a single letter M. His father had given it to him on the morning of his 18th birthday. He had never given it to another man. He held it out to Victor. Victor looked at the blade. He did not understand at first. His eyes went from the steel to Alessandro's face and back again, and something in his throat closed. Alessandro said, quietly, 3 days ago, Leonardo tied you with a rope I could not see. Tonight, you cut it yourself. With this knife. In your own hand. Victor took it. His fingers closed around the horn grip. His hand shook not the tremor of fear, which he had learned to master years ago in this house, but a different tremor, deeper, the tremor of a man holding something he had not believed he would ever be given. Alessandro's voice went lower. It was steady, but there was iron in it now. After tonight, whatever happens, if you live, you keep this knife. If you die, this knife goes to Lucia. With one message. Her father cut his own rope. No one cut it for him. She will understand it when she is old enough. Victor could not speak. His hand tightened on the horn grip. Then his other hand rose, and he took hold of Alessandro's hand, not the way a soldier grips the hand of his boss, not the way a subordinate touches his don's ring, but the way a brother took the hand of a brother in a doorway before one of them walked into a room he might not walk out of. He did not let go for 10 seconds. Alessandro did not pull his hand away. He allowed the grip. He returned it quiet, level, without ceremony. At last Victor spoke. His voice was hoarse again, hoarser than it had been in the confession, because now it was carrying a different weight. Alessandro, if I do not come back, you tell Lucia that her father loved her enough to have been ready to betray the man he had loved as blood, in order to save her. That is not a defense. That is only so she will know. Alessandro nodded, slowly. I will tell her. But you will tell her first. He squeezed Victor's hand one last time. Then he let go. Go, draw armor. Vehicles at 10:30. Do not be late. Victor nodded. He turned, the Damascus blade held loosely at his side in the hand that had not stopped trembling, and he walked to the study door. He paused at the threshold. He did not step through immediately. For one moment he turned his head back and looked at Alessandro across the length of the room, looked at the man he had almost killed 3 days ago in the ordinary weakness of an ordinary week, the man who had just placed into his hand the knife with which to cut his own bonds. There were no words for that look. There was no word in either of their vocabularies that had ever needed to hold what passed between them in that half-second. Then he stepped through the doorway, and the door closed behind him with a small, careful sound. Alessandro stood alone in the study. He walked back to the walnut desk. He placed both hands on the wood, one on either side of the folded Bronx map, and he lowered his head for the first time all night. Outside, in the Bronx, the rain was already waiting for him. The convoy left the estate at 10:32. 4 black SUVs, engines low, headlights killed the moment the last vehicle cleared the gate. No emblems, no plates that would show under a streetlight. No radios open on any channel a Bronx patrol car might scan. Alessandro rode in the lead vehicle with Victor. Tony sat in the front passenger seat. Marco held the wheel. 2 of the 12 soldiers filled the second row behind them, weapons cradled in their laps, faces already gone into the flat stillness men wear before they walk into rooms they may not walk out of. No one spoke. The rain came harder when the convoy climbed onto the Long Island Expressway. It struck the roofs of the 4 vehicles in a steady percussion, the last rain of a New York March, the rain that always fell hardest in the final week before the city surrendered to spring, and to a man sitting in the back seat with a Damascus knife against his hip, it sounded exactly like a countdown. The convoy crossed the Triborough. The lights of Manhattan glittered wet and distant on the left. The lights of the Bronx were waiting to the front. 45 minutes. The vehicles rolled to a halt 300 meters short of the old munitions warehouse, on the wrong side of a broken chain-link fence, in the shadow of an abandoned coal storage silo that had not been used in 30 years. The men stepped out into the rain. Doors were closed with practiced hands, without slamming. Weapons were drawn. Communications were switched to the encrypted frequency. The 3 teams separated according to the geometry that had been drawn on the walnut desk 4 hours ago. Before they split, Alessandro looked at every man. He did not speak. He only nodded. Every man understood. Team A moved off toward the front of the building. Team B circled east, toward the service lines that fed the warehouse's power. Team C, Alessandro, Victor, and the 2 best shooters the Moretti family owned, began the walk toward the storm sewer access. Watches were synchronized. 11:21 at night. Team A struck the front door with a small charge of C4, and the first blast of the night went up into the rain like the opening note of an orchestra, tuning itself in a room that had not yet realized a concert was about to begin. It was not a large explosion. It was designed to be loud, not lethal. Somewhere inside the warehouse, gunfire answered first 1 weapon, then 3, then a chorus. The building woke. Team B cut the primary feed at the eastern junction. Every light inside the warehouse went out at once. Every camera went dark. The building had been depending on grid power without a live backup, a small arrogance of Leonardo Russo's. One Victor had noted in his own 3 days of listening, and it paid for that arrogance now in 3 seconds of total blindness. Alessandro and Victor entered the storm sewer. The water in the tunnel reached the tops of their boots. The stench was thick, 3 decades of settled Bronx runoff, black with grease and iron. Thermal optics dropped down over 4 sets of eyes. The soldiers led. Alessandro walked at the middle. Victor walked at the rear, not because he mattered less, but because Alessandro had refused, at the last moment before descent, to allow Victor to be the first target if someone had thought to wait for them inside the tunnel. 30 seconds later, they reached the steel door of the eastern basement. Sound came through it, muffled but unmistakable. A woman's breathing, held tight. A child's voice, thin and broken, crying. Victor stopped breathing. Alessandro raised his hand. 3 fingers, then 2, then 1, the countdown. He nodded to the lead soldier. The man pressed a small breaching charge against the hinges of the door and stepped back into the shadow of the tunnel wall. The steel door blew inward. Inside the basement, Elena was tied to a wooden chair in the middle of the concrete floor. A cloth was bound across her mouth. The bruises on her face were worse than the videos had shown. The swelling on her left eye had spread down into the cheek, and there was dried blood on her chin from a wound Alessandro could not see clearly. Beside her sat Lucia, also tied, her small body slumped forward against the ropes, her head hanging. 2 guards stood in the room. One held a short-barreled pistol at the left corner. The other stood beside Elena's chair with a black-handled knife. Both had turned their heads toward the sound of the gunfire above them. Neither was ready for the breach at their back. Victor entered first, as Alessandro had promised. Victor fired 2 rounds into the chest of the man with the pistol, center mass, both rounds inside a space no wider than a fist. The guard folded to his knees and pitched forward before his own weapon had cleared its holster. Alessandro moved on the knifeman. He crossed the distance in 2 strides. The Damascus blade came free of the sheath at his hip in the same motion, and the fight ended in 2 seconds clean, unshowy, the way his father had taught him at 15. The knife had been on his belt at Victor's request only 9 hours earlier, returned before departure as a symbol, not a working tool, but it worked now with the ease of the tool it had always been. Victor dropped his weapon and ran to Elena. His hands shook as he pulled the cloth from her mouth and cut the ropes at her wrists with a small folding blade from his coat pocket. She opened her eyes, slowly, as if she were afraid of what she would see. She recognized him. She burst into tears without a sound. She had learned to weep without sound in the last 3 days, and her body had not yet remembered how to weep any other way. She whispered, "You came. You really came?" Victor could not answer. He gathered her against his chest with one arm and reached across her to lift Lucia. Alessandro had already begun to cut the ropes on the child. Lucia was half-conscious, drugged, but breathing evenly. Her small chest rose and fell in a rhythm that told Alessandro she was still alive and still whole. Her eyes opened halfway. She recognized the man leaning over her. Not the boss of a family, not the head of the Eastern Seaboard. Her godfather, the man who had held her at her christening, the man who had given her the pink cardigan. She smiled a weak, drifting smile and closed her eyes again. Alessandro lifted her, carefully, as though she were made of paper. He turned to Victor. "Out, now, through the tunnel." Victor nodded. He lifted Elena. She was exhausted, unable to stand, and cradled her against him, one arm beneath her knees, one across her back. The two soldiers took point again, weapons raised. They moved out into the basement corridor. Above them, on the upper floors, the gunfire had not slowed. Team A was drawing fire at the front. Team B was holding the eastern service door for their exit. The building itself had begun to fill with smoke. From something burning on the second floor, a curtain, a wooden pallet. Alessandro did not know and did not care. He was counting distance, 60 meters to the tunnel mouth, 50, 40. At the bend of the concrete corridor, halfway to the exit, a figure staggered around the corner behind them. He was not part of a coordinated ambush. He was one of Leonardo's men lost in the confusion of the raid, cut off from his squad, guessing at a way out and taking the wrong turn. He had come down the wrong stair and picked the wrong hallway. And now he stood facing the backs of 4 intruders and 2 hostages. And he raised his weapon. The barrel came up. It came up level with Elena. Victor saw it first. He could not fire. His weapon lay on the concrete of the basement floor behind them, dropped the moment he had lifted Elena into his arms. He could not shout. Sound did not travel faster than a bullet, and the barrel was already raised. He had time for one thing only. He turned. He pushed Elena bodily toward Alessandro, a hard, deliberate shove that sent her into the wall on the safer side of the corridor, and he placed himself between her body and the barrel of the Russo soldier's gun. He did not raise his hands. He did not try to shield her with his arms. He turned his back to the shooter, on purpose, so that when the rounds came they would strike him and not go through him. 4 shots, one after another. 3 of them found the middle of Victor's back. The 4th went wide, struck the concrete wall 10 centimeters above Alessandro's temple, and buried itself in the block with a small final puff of gray dust. Elena screamed. The sound came out of her the way an animal's scream comes out of an animal, not from the mouth alone but from the whole chest. From 3 days of silence torn open in a single second. The corridor amplified it, and for one long half-heartbeat every man in Team C stood frozen inside that sound. Lucia woke to her mother's scream. Her small eyes opened and she saw her father folding forward. The front of his body still turned to shield her mother, the silver crucifix at his throat suddenly loose. The chain snapped by the impact, falling free of his shirt collar and rolling in a small arc across the concrete floor, slick with the blood that had already begun to reach. Alessandro did not think. He passed Lucia into the arms of one of the soldiers without looking at either of them. He caught Elena by the shoulder and pushed her against the safe corner of the wall. Then he turned and raised his own weapon. He fired 3 rounds at the Russo shooter. Chest, throat, forehead. The man had not yet finished his 4th trigger pull. The shots were not rushed. They were not angry. They were precise, the way his father had taught him to shoot at 15, in the cellar of an old brownstone in Bay Ridge. When precision under pressure had been the only inheritance his father had cared about giving him, the shooter dropped where he stood. His body had not yet touched the concrete before Alessandro was already turning back. He knelt beside Victor. 3 holes in the back of the black wool coat. The blood coming out of them was dark, and there was a fine frothing at the edges of the middle wound. The frothing that meant a round had crossed a lung, and the lung was filling. Victor was still conscious. His eyes were unfocused, drifting, but he found Elena where Alessandro had pushed her, safe against the wall. He found Lucia in the arms of the soldier. He found both of them alive, unharmed, breathing, held. Then he smiled. Alessandro had known Victor Romano for 15 years, and in 15 years he had never seen the man smile like this. It was not a smile of relief. It was not a smile of pain shared. It was not even the small, private half-smile Victor sometimes gave to Alessandro across a dinner table, when both of them noticed the same absurdity in a room, and neither of them chose to name it. It was the smile of a man who had done the one thing he had asked to be allowed to do. He whispered to Elena, and his voice was already thinning. "I promised, didn't I?" Elena went down on both knees beside him. She took his hand between hers and held it against her chest, and her tears began to fall onto his face, running along the line of his cheekbone toward his ear. She was speaking to him, but she was also speaking to some part of the ceiling above them, to the God she had stopped speaking to at 15 years old and had begun speaking to again 3 days ago. Do not go. Do not go. Lucia needs you. I need you. You do not get to go. You do not get to go. Victor's eyes moved from her face to Alessandro's. His hand rose slowly, unsteadily, and he found Alessandro's wrist and closed his fingers around it. The grip was weak. The grip was the grip of a man who had already begun to leave his own body. Alessandro, forgive me. Alessandro cut him off. His own voice cracked a small, private fracture along a single sentence. The first crack anyone had heard in his voice in 20 years. And there were only 4 people in the corridor to hear it, and none of them would ever speak of it. You have never betrayed me, Victor. Not the night of the bomb. Not tonight. Not one time. Keep your eyes open. You are not going anywhere. There is a kind of loyalty that survives even the bullet meant for someone else. It does not need forgiveness because it never asked permission to exist. Victor Romano had lived his life carrying 2 loves he could not divide, and in the end, they both survived because he refused to choose which one to save. Alessandro pressed his palm down over the largest of the wounds in Victor's back and drove his weight through the heel of his hand. Blood welled through his fingers and ran down onto the concrete. He raised his other hand to his throat mic. Medical. To the eastern basement corridor. Now, the medical team had been staged with the assault force, 200 meters back from the warehouse under the sagging steel awning of an abandoned scrapyard. They were moving before the transmission had ended. 30 seconds. They came in through the same tunnel Team C had entered by. 4 men with a folding stretcher and a hard case of trauma supplies and an oxygen unit slung between 2 of them. Alessandro did not lift his hand from the wound until they were beside him. E2 extraction point. Straight to Mount Sinai. Dr. Rossi is already waiting. Elena and Lucia go with him. He looked down. The silver crucifix was still lying on the concrete where it had rolled a moment before. The broken chain curled around it, the small silver arms of it wet with the same dark blood that was now everywhere across the floor. He picked it up. He wiped it once against the sleeve of his own coat. Then he leaned over Victor and placed the crucifix flat against the center of Victor's chest, the same place it had rested for 15 years, minus the chain. Without ceremony. He did not tie it. He did not fasten it. He only laid it there. Elena did not release Victor's hand as the medical team lifted him onto the stretcher. She walked beside him with her fingers threaded through his. And Lucia, awake now, entirely awake, all of her small body finally in the world, clung to her mother's leg with both arms and could not form words. She only cried, silently, the way she had learned in the last 3 days from a mother who had been teaching her without knowing. The helicopter lifted from the E2 extraction point 6 minutes later. Alessandro stood in the open ground beside the concrete pad and watched the rotor lights climb into the black sky above the Bronx. Rain fell across his shoulders in sheets. He did not move as the aircraft banked south and vanished behind the roofline of the warehouse district. Then he turned back toward the building. Inside that structure, on the 3rd floor, in the corner office, at the end of the east hallway, was a man he still needed to see with his own eyes. A man he would not be handing to any helicopter. Alessandro walked back into the warehouse through the front. The main hall had already been secured. Tony's team and Marco's team had converged on the ground floor, and the fighting there was over. Russo bodies lay scattered along the concrete, some slumped against overturned crates, some fallen mid-stride in the middle of the open floor, some half inside the doorways they had tried to defend. 3 Moretti soldiers had taken rounds and were being treated against the far wall by the 2nd medical team. None of them were going to die. Tony came out of the eastern corridor to meet him. There was blood streaked across his cheek and along the line of his jaw. It was not his blood. He had confirmed this by wiping it once with the back of his hand and moving on. His voice was low, professional, entirely functional. He is on the 3rd floor, end of the eastern hallway. 5 bodyguards left with him. Alessandro did not stop. He crossed the main hall and started up the metal staircase without slowing his stride. Tony fell in behind him at the left. Marco came down from the 2nd floor landing and joined them at the right, weapon already reloaded. Alessandro's right hand was still wet. He did not look at it. He did not wipe it against his coat. Victor's blood had darkened the seam between his thumb and forefinger and had begun to stiffen along the underside of his cuff, and he carried it up the stairs the way another man might have carried a rosary. 2nd floor. 2 Russo guards opened up from the crack of a service door on the east side of the landing. The muzzle flashes lit the wall behind them in a stuttering yellow. Tony dropped to one knee and returned 3 rounds in a controlled burst. One guard went down inside the doorway. Marco fired twice from the corner and took the second man high in the throat. The service door swung slowly closed behind them on its own weight. Third floor. The final two bodyguards had positioned themselves in front of the corner office at the end of the eastern hallway. They were young. Alessandro registered this without emotion, and their weapons were held too tight. Alessandro dropped the man on the left with the first round he fired at the top of the stairs. Tony took the man on the right 2 seconds later. Alessandro walked the length of the hallway alone. Tony and Marco held position at the mouth of the corridor, out of the line of the door. He stopped in front of the office. He did not kick. He did not raise his voice. He did not identify himself. He spoke in the calm, level tone he had used one afternoon 11 months ago at a walnut conference table in Midtown Manhattan to close a real estate deal for 4 apartment buildings in Queens. Leonardo, open the door. If I have to kick it in, I will let you bleed for 3 hours before I let you die. If you open it, I will kill you in 30 seconds. Choose. Silence. For 6 seconds. Nothing moved on either side of the wood. Then the lock turned. The door opened inward, slowly, and Leonardo Russo stood on the other side of it, 55 years old, bald across the crown, the last of his gray hair combed back over his ears, small, gold-rimmed glasses catching the emergency light from the corridor. He wore a white dress shirt with the top 2 buttons open, his tie loosened but not removed. His hands were raised not fully, only to the middle of his chest, an incomplete surrender designed to buy him 3 sentences before the decision was made. His mouth found a smile. Alessandro, brother, we can talk. This is only business. Alessandro walked into the office. Slowly, he did not smile back. He closed the door behind him with the same care Tony had closed the study door on Long Island 4 hours earlier. He glanced around the room. A cheap cherrywood desk with a scratched veneer, fake leather chairs whose stitching had begun to split at the seams. A liquor cabinet stocked full but stocked entirely with imported bottles that any true don of the eastern seaboard would have recognized as low-grade knockoff labels. Framed prints on the walls of cars and boats Leonardo did not own. A room built to impress men who did not know better. This was the office of a man who had been playing at being a boss. It was not the office of a boss. Alessandro spoke. His voice remained level. You kidnapped the wife and the 8-year-old daughter of the man I hold as blood. You forced him to plant a bomb to kill me. You made 37 videos of a child being terrorized, so you could hold a knife to the heart of her father. And now you tell me this is only business. Leonardo's lips parted to answer. He did not get the chance. His right hand dropped from the middle of his chest toward the pistol he had holstered inside his suit jacket. The motion was slow. It was the motion of a man who had spent a decade believing he could out-negotiate anyone in any room and had never had to draw for himself. Alessandro was faster. Alessandro had been faster for 20 years. He fired 1 round. It struck Leonardo in the chest, not in the heart. To the right of it, into the upper lobe of the right lung. Alessandro had chosen the placement. He wanted this man to bleed slowly. He wanted this man to have 3 minutes of consciousness in which to understand that he was dying in the corner office of the very building from which he had schemed to seize the eastern seaboard, and that his death was being administered by the man he had believed he had already erased. Leonardo went down. His hand clutched at the front of his shirt. The pistol slipped from his fingers and clattered against the corner of the cherrywood desk before falling to the floor. His mouth opened. It shaped what might have been a word. No sound came out. Alessandro walked to him. He did not crouch. He knelt on one knee beside the fallen man and looked directly into Leonardo Russo's eyes. He did not speak. He did not need to. There was nothing that needed to be said inside those 3 minutes that had not already been said by the placement of the round. Alessandro waited. He watched the small, ragged rise and fall of Leonardo's chest slow, then stagger, then stop. 3 minutes and 7 seconds after the shot, he rose. He walked to the door. He opened it and stepped out into the hall. Tony was waiting at the corner. Alessandro extended his right hand. Tony reached into the breast pocket of his own coat and produced a folded white handkerchief and passed it to him. Alessandro wiped his hand. Victor's blood mixed with Leonardo's blood, dark on the white cloth, and returned it. Tony pocketed it without looking at it. Finish here, Alessandro said quietly. No one of Leonardo's organization walks out. Then burn the building down to the concrete. Do not leave a single mark that reads Moretti. In the morning, the fire department will find a gas explosion of unknown origin. Tony nodded. Alessandro walked back down the metal staircase. He crossed the ground floor without looking at any of the bodies. He stepped out into the rain and crossed the broken lot to the SUV, where Marco was already waiting behind the wheel. He opened the rear door and got in. Mount Sinai, he said. Direct. Do not stop. Marco pulled the vehicle around and drove. Alessandro sat in the back seat with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the rain running down the window. 52 minutes away, on a surgical table in an operating theater on the 4th floor of the hospital, Victor Romano was still fighting a battle that had nothing to do with the one they had just won, and Alessandro Moretti did not know whether the man he had called his brother for 15 years would still be breathing when the sun came up over the East River, Mount Sinai, 2:15 in the morning. Alessandro arrived directly from the Bronx. He was still wearing the body armor beneath his suit jacket, the vest concealed under a fresh coat he had pulled from the SUV's rear compartment during the drive. Beneath the sleeve of the coat, the underside of his right cuff was still darkened by a stain that had not fully dried. He had wiped his hand twice on the drive down. It had not been enough. The hospital security team met him at the service entrance. They were Moretti men placed inside the building at midnight, quietly, under the pretext of a private security detail for a family patient, and they had been waiting for him for the last hour. 2 of them fell in on either side and led him to the private elevator that ran to the 4th floor. Neither of them spoke. The elevator doors opened onto the recovery corridor. Dr. Rossi stepped out of the operating theater at almost the same moment. 30 years the doctor had served this family. 30 years of pulling rounds out of Moretti bodies in back rooms and warehouse basements and private surgical suites paid for in cash. His scrubs tonight were dark with blood at the chest and along the seam of the right hip. His glasses had slid down the bridge of his nose. His face was gray with the exhaustion of a man who had been standing over a table for 4 hours and had not yet decided what he could safely tell the man walking toward him. He met Alessandro halfway down the corridor. 3 rounds, he said. His voice was clipped, professional, without softness the way he had learned to give reports in this house long ago, the way Alessandro required them. 1 entered close to the spine. We removed it. The cord is intact, he will walk again. 1 passed through the right lung. We placed a chest drain. That one gave us the most trouble. He lost a great deal of blood before we opened him. The 3rd stopped 3 centimeters from the heart. We did not extract it. The risk of moving it was greater than the risk of leaving it in place. He is alive, but the next 48 hours will decide. Alessandro nodded. He did not speak. There was nothing to say that Rossi did not already know. Elena had been brought into the family waiting area at the end of the corridor. The bruises on her face had been photographed for the record the family kept of its own wounds, then cleaned and treated. The split at her lower lip had been closed with 3 small, careful stitches. She was whole. She would carry marks for a month, and she would carry the memory for the rest of her life. But her body would come back. Lucia had been given a light sedative to help her rest. She was sleeping in the room beside her mother, on a folded cot, under the watchful eye of a nurse who had orders not to leave her side. Alessandro walked past the waiting area without stopping. He stepped into the recovery room where Victor lay. Victor was motionless on the bed. A tube ran into his mouth for the ventilator. 2 intravenous lines were seated in the veins of both forearms. Monitors on the wall above the headboard traced the slow, patient sinewave of his heart, and the ventilator worked in a quiet mechanical rhythm that answered it in count. The room smelled of antiseptic, and of the faint metallic edge that no post-operative room fully hid. The silver crucifix was lying on the small bedside table. The chain was still broken. A nurse had unfastened it and set it aside when the surgical team had cut his shirt open in the ambulance bay. It rested there beside a plastic cup of water. Victor could not drink, its dented silver arms catching the low blue light of the room. Alessandro picked it up. He looked at it for a long time. Then he sat down in the chair beside the bed. He laid the crucifix flat against the center of Victor's chest over the hospital gown, over the bandages, over the place it had rested for 15 years and left it there without the chain. It did not need the chain. It only needed to be where it had always been. He took Victor's right hand. He did not squeeze. He did not hold tight. He simply closed his own hand around Victor's and let it rest there against the sheet. He did not let go for 37 hours. Elena came in. She stood at the foot of the bed for a long moment, one hand at her mouth, and then she went out again to check on her daughter, and came back and stood at the foot of the bed again. Alessandro watched her the 3rd time she came. He rose from the chair, walked to her, and placed his free hand, the left one, the one that was not holding Victor, lightly on her shoulder. "She needs you," he said. "I am here with him." Elena nodded. She did not argue. She went back to Lucia's room and stayed there. Dr. Rossi came and went. He checked the monitors. He adjusted an intravenous line. He nodded at Alessandro without speaking and left. He returned every 4 hours through the first night, and every 6 through the day that followed, and each time he came he took the pulse at Victor's other wrist and made a small note on the chart at the foot of the bed and did not disturb the boss on the other side. Nurses came and went. Fluid bags were exchanged. The catheter drain from the chest was measured and emptied. Someone brought Alessandro coffee at some point on the first morning. Someone brought him coffee again in the late afternoon. He drank it black. He did not eat. He did not sleep. His phone had been switched off since the Bronx. At the 37th hour, Victor's eyes opened. He could not speak. The ventilator was still down his throat, but his eyes found Alessandro across the small distance of the bed, and they held. They focused. They knew. His fingers moved, weak, searching. They found Alessandro's hand. Alessandro closed his own hand tighter. Victor exhaled a slow, thin breath through his nose and closed his eyes again. But this time it was the sleep of the living. Alessandro lowered his head. He did not weep. He had not wept since the funeral of his father, and he did not weep now. But his shoulders shook once, a single, silent contraction that moved through him from the base of the neck to the small of the back, and for the space of 30 seconds he sat with his head bowed over the hand he was holding, and he did not lift it. Then, quietly, he took the boss's control down over his face again. He rose from the chair. He walked out into the corridor for the first time in 37 hours. Elena was sitting on one of the green plastic chairs against the wall, Lucia asleep across her lap with a hospital blanket pulled up to the child's chin. She looked up at Alessandro's approach. She read his face before he spoke, and she began to shake before he said anything, because after 72 hours of learning to read the terrible faces of men, she had begun to be able to read the good ones too. Alessandro said 2 words. "He is awake." Elena broke. It was the first sound she had made since her scream in the basement corridor of the Bronx, the first real sound. The first sound that carried, the first sound of the woman she had been before Tuesday. She wept openly, without covering her mouth, and the sound of it woke Lucia in her lap, and the child looked up at her mother's crying face and understood, in the way small children sometimes understood the largest things without being told them, that the world had opened again. 3 weeks later, Victor could sit up. He could eat broth without help. He could laugh when Lucia climbed onto the chair beside his bed and unfolded, in careful order, every drawing she had made during the 2 weeks her mother had kept her home from school. The bruises on Elena's face had faded to a pale yellow along the cheekbone, and only the small, stitched line at her lower lip still marked her. She had begun to smile again, though the smile still carried a small tremor at one corner that Alessandro doubted would ever entirely leave. Alessandro visited on the Wednesday of the 3rd week. He brought a bouquet of sunflowers, the flower Victor had once told him, 6 years ago in a Long Island kitchen at Christmas, was Elena's favorite. Elena took Lucia down to the cafeteria for ice cream to give the 2 men the room. Victor spoke first. His voice was still hoarse, but it was steady now. "Alessandro, before anything else, thank you." Alessandro set the flowers down on the bedside table and took the chair. "For what? For forgiving, for listening, for bringing them home, for not killing me in that room the night I asked you to, which is what your father would have ordered." Alessandro did not answer immediately. He looked at Victor for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, "My father taught one thing wrong. He taught it having never had to choose. I chose differently." Victor nodded. He drew a slow breath. His chest still ached at the sight of the 3rd round. The one 3 centimeters from the heart, the one that would remain inside him for the rest of his life, and he spoke the sentence he had been holding for 3 weeks. "I have something to ask." "Ask." "I want to leave the family." Alessandro was not surprised. He had known. He nodded slowly. "Not because I have lost faith in you. Not because I am angry. Not because I regret 15 years. Only because I want to live an ordinary life with Elena and Lucia. I want my daughter to grow up knowing her father as a carpenter or a truck driver, anything that is not a gun. I want to sleep at night without listening for the sound of someone coming for my child a second time." Alessandro reached into the inside pocket of his coat and drew out a thick, sealed envelope. He laid it on the bedside table beside the sunflowers. "Enough for 3 generations. Your daughter will attend the finest university she can be admitted to without borrowing a single dollar. Your wife will have the house she has wanted since the day you married her. This is not wages. This is not payment for silence. This is the gift my father would have given you on the day he put that crucifix around your neck if he had lived to see a night like the one in the Bronx." Victor opened the envelope. He looked at the amount. He opened his mouth to refuse. "Do not," Alessandro said. "This is not a discussion." Victor closed the envelope. He nodded. Then he took Alessandro's hand, once, without words. "4 of my men will keep watch over your house for 5 years," Alessandro continued, "at a distance. You will never see them. You will never know they are there. But if any surviving fragment of the Russo organization or anyone else considers laying a hand on your family, they will die before they reach your gate." Victor's grip tightened. Alessandro rose. He walked to the door. He stopped there, one hand on the frame, and did not turn back. Live a long time, Victor. For me, for Lucia, for Elena. Then he stepped out, the door closed softly behind him. 9 months later, the small brick house sat at the edge of a coastal town in Connecticut, 2 stories. A wooden swing on the front porch Victor had built himself. Tomato plants in the backyard rising in neat rows along a trellis Elena had staked out over 3 weekends in April. No high fence, no iron gate, no cameras. A yellow Labrador dozed on the porch in the late afternoon light. Alessandro stopped the black car 40 meters up the street. He stepped out alone. No guards, no driver. He wore a gray wool sweater instead of a suit, something he had done perhaps 4 times in 20 years. He did not ring the bell. He did not open the gate. He only stood at the low hedge that bordered the sidewalk and looked across it. In the backyard, Victor was pushing Lucia on the wooden swing. She was 9 years old now. Her laughter carried across the yard the way the laughter of a child carried only when the child had been permitted to live the whole of a childhood without knowing what had almost been taken from her. Victor was laughing with her, the easy, unguarded laugh Alessandro had never once seen in 15 years on the man who had stepped in front of 7 bullets meant for him. Beneath Victor's collar, the silver crucifix, its chain repaired, caught the low sun. Elena stepped out of the back door with a tray of fresh bread and set it on the wooden garden table. She was smiling. She was calling her husband and her daughter to supper. She saw Alessandro at the hedge. She stopped. She did not wave. She only smiled the small, wordless, grateful smile of a woman who had understood the geometry of the man standing at the end of her walk, and understood that he would not cross the hedge, because to cross the hedge would be to bring the dark with him. Alessandro inclined his head to her. Not long, only a single nod. Then he turned away. Before he reached the car, he heard Lucia's voice float across the yard. Baba, andoy. She was calling her father, not him. That was better than anything he had allowed himself to hope for. He did not turn back. He was afraid that if he did, he would want to stay, and that was the one thing his world would not permit. But he smiled a rare, quiet, private smile no one but himself would ever know had existed as he opened the door of the car. He drove away slowly. In the rearview mirror, the red brick house grew small. The swing kept moving. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. The yellow dog did not stir on the porch. Alessandro fixed his eyes forward. He was going back to New York. Back to the Long Island estate. Back to the walnut desk that 9 months ago had almost been his tomb, the desk that now, under the summer afternoon light through the tall French windows, carried no trace of the bomb and no trace of the blood. But the mark inside him did, and he was grateful for it. Sometimes the greatest betrayal is not betrayal at all. It is a good man forced to choose between 2 loves he cannot divide. And sometimes the greatest mercy is not forgiveness, it is refusing to call it betrayal in the first place. If you were Alessandro that night, would you have pulled the trigger on Victor, or would you have cut the rope? Let us know in the comments below. We read every one. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, subscribe to our channel, share it with someone who believes second chances still exist, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Thank you for staying with us until the very last word.